Was the universe created from nothing? Ex nihilo? What does the science really say? Is it consistent with the cosmological argument we discussed a few weeks ago? Join me today as we dive into some of the science behind the beginning. Welcome to the Mom Apologist, where apologetics meets discipleship. This is a safe place for your doubts, where we seek to answer the question, God is real, the Bible's true, now what? So join me as we learn to think biblically about how we walk through this life as believers, struggling with tough questions, seeking hope, and finding answers together. Now, a few weeks ago, I presented what I call my first pillar of faith. The universe didn't create itself. In this episode, I gave a simple overview of the cosmological argument. I didn't really go very deep into the issues. I just kind of gave you the hits, so to speak, just kind of covering the basic argument itself and some of the science. So tonight I'm going to go a little bit deeper for you and address some of the common rebuttals or objections to the idea that the universe was created ex nihilo. Now that means out of nothing. But before we get into what that means and the science behind it, let's talk about the cosmological argument. In case you missed that episode, the cosmological argument is a syllogism that says things that begin to exist have a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. I talked a little bit about some of the science behind that belief. The discovery of the red shift of galaxies moving away from us, and the discovery of that expansion of the universe by Edwin Hubble. We talked about the second law of thermodynamics and the idea of entropy, that things run out of energy, that energy just kind of dissipates and chaos reigns. And that eliminates some of the ideas of like a cyclical universe or one that expands and contracts repeatedly because we would have run out of energy a long time ago. We also see that our universe is actually still expanding. And when you look at the edges of the universe, we think of like an explosion, and you think when it gets to the edge, it starts to slow down. But that's not what we're seeing when we look at the universe. The farthest galaxies from us are actually speeding away from us faster than the ones that are closer. So we see things that don't quite seem to make sense if we were looking at kind of a cyclical expand and contract kind of universe. We talked briefly about the law of infinite regress. Now, that's the idea that time could always be infinite. And the law of infinite regress is a philosophical argument that basically says if time was moving backwards into infinity, always adding one more as it moves into infinity, that time would never move forward because we can't move backwards and forwards at the same time. Now, some people argue against this idea because in math, the concept of infinity can exist, but it's conceptual. It is not reality. It's not physical. In reality, you cannot have an actual infinite number of concrete things or events because infinity can't exist in reality. So only a potential infinite, like a process that could continue indefinitely, could be true. Okay, David Hilbert. You might have heard of Hilbert's Hotel if you've studied this argument at all. William Lane Craig talks about it, where it's this idea of a hotel that has an infinite number of rooms. And if you can picture that, okay, an infinite number of rooms, let's say we remove all of the odd number rooms, but we'd still have an infinite number of rooms. So in the real world, that doesn't make sense. Conceptually, it makes sense, but in the physical world, it doesn't make sense. It leads to logical contradictions. So In order for time to move forward, it has to have a beginning. And there are other attempts to rebut this concept, but they really don't have any kind of solid evidence that proves that they work or that time could be infinite. And they're just a lot of suppositions that require, honestly, as much faith, in a different way as Christianity does. So, we could get into the weeds of talking about different theories of time, but if we're concrete, talking about what's physically possible and true, time can only move in one direction. It violates the laws of physics that we know to be true to say otherwise. So now let's get into some of the concerns about the cosmological argument. Creationists, theists, intelligent design proponents all believe the universe had a beginning from nothing. We say that's ex nihilo. So, did the universe have a beginning out of nothing? Well, let's explain what we mean from nothing. We mean no pre-existing matter, space, or time. Now, both science and scripture affirm that there was a beginning. Obviously, Genesis 1:1 says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." So biblically, we know that there was a beginning. But a lot of our modern cosmology also points to a very specific starting point for space, time, and matter. Now, naturalists or materialists will often call this the Big Bang. And we can call it that too. It certainly was a very large explosion, an instantaneous eruption, if you will, of everything all at once. Now, this idea comes from an understanding of gravity and space and time and matter and how these things fit. So we look at Einstein's theory of general relativity. He proposed this in 1915, and we did discuss this a little bit in the last podcast about creation, but I want to go a little further into what gravity actually is, because while we don't understand why it works, we do understand how it works, and it's not the way most of us envision. Unless you've studied gravity at any length, most of us think of gravity like a magnet, something pulling towards each other. And that's not really how gravity works. Gravity is more like a bowling ball on a trampoline. If you can imagine that, the weight of that bowling ball creates a divot in the fabric of the trampoline, just like a planet or a sun makes a divot in the fabric of space-time. And it causes smaller things to move toward it. And then they create their own grooves in the fabric. And that's why we have kind of round orbits. They're not circular, but they're roundish. Okay, when you think of gravity and centrifugal force and how that kind of all works together. Okay, so the theory there is that space and time are linked together like a fabric, and the universe itself can stretch or curve, not just the objects moving within it. So when cosmologists start applying these equations to the universe as a whole, they discovered that the fabric of the universe is expanding. So it was once smaller than it is now, and it's getting larger constantly. So if it was smaller, that also means things were closer together. And if things were closer together, they were also denser. Now, Dr. Stephen Meyer of the Discovery Institute talks about how if we see gravity is getting flatter, like the way the universe is shaped is getting flatter, if we rewind it, we get more and more curve. And as we get more and more curve, we do eventually result in a singularity. Matter becomes an infinite density. And this infinite density becomes infinitely tight. This infinitely tight curvature corresponds to zero spatial volume. You know how much stuff fits in zero spatial volume? That's right, nothing. There's no space so that nothing can fit there. So this is a real concept of nothing. Like what J. Warner Wallace says rocks dream about. Nothing. Now, Stephen Hawking has a different idea of the singularity. So Hawking and Roger Penrose also used Einstein's math to trace the cosmic history backward. And they thought if the universe is expanding, then of course everything's at one point was compressed into a singularity. Now, they use the term singularity, and sometimes we get this idea that it's a small, like, dot in space. But that's not really true. It's literally the point where space and time themselves collapse into themselves. The laws of physics no longer apply. So we have all of space, time, and matter compressed into nothing. It didn't exist. So this is a moment where the word before doesn't have a meaning. There was nothing before. In the Grand Design in 2010, Stephen Hawking and Leonard Mlodinow wrote, "Because there is such a law as gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing." Now, at first glance, you say, well, okay, he says the universe will create itself from nothing, except that's not really what he's saying. His idea of nothing includes gravity. So gravity is not nothing. Where did gravity come from? Why does gravity exist? Especially when you think of our explanation of gravity as explaining how the fabric of space and time move. Gravity is certainly not nothing. So what Hawking meant by nothing is not the absence of anything whatsoever, like as theists and creationists and intelligent design proponents, we believe nothing meant nothing, no space, no time, no matter, no energy, no laws, nothing. Hawking refers to it as a quantum vacuum. Now, a quantum vacuum is a field governed by the laws of quantum mechanics, and particles will appear and disappear momentarily due to fluctuations in that field. But the idea of saying, well, these particles then are creating themselves or are popping into existence isn't really quite accurate. It's more that they appear and disappear, and we're still trying to understand what causes them to appear and disappear, what fluctuations affect the particles. Why does this happen? So it still has a cause of some sort, even if we don't know what it is yet. So the idea that the universe could spontaneously pop into existence through a quantum fluctuation because laws like gravity and quantum mechanics allow such an event to occur doesn't seem to really truly have the explanatory power that it needs to have. So when we look at the idea of what Hawking's nothing, from a philosophical standpoint, you can't say the universe creates itself, because for something to create itself, it would have had to already exist before it existed. So that's a logical contradiction. And it presupposes the law of physics existing. So if the laws of gravity or quantum mechanics existed before the universe, then that's not nothing. Those laws are something. Okay? We also have a metaphysical issue. Hawking never explains why the laws exist. Where do they come from? Laws don't have causal power. They describe what is going on. They describe the way things are or the way things work. They don't explain where it came from. It's like the speed limit on the side of the road. It can tell you how fast you should go. It can't tell you who put the sign there, why the law exists. So we have a replacement of the idea of a creator or God with gravity, but we've assumed the laws that govern math and physics as if they have to exist, if they're self-existent. But laws can't be self-existent. Forces don't choose when to act either. So if we have a singularity that's more like Stephen Hawking's idea of the singularity, where there's particles doing things, something is causing them to do things. Something's causing them to react, to appear, to disappear. What is causing that? We don't really get back to the idea of a first cause that way. It also doesn't explain why, when the universe exploded, the expansion rate was just so that allowed for the creation of the universe. Dr. Stephen Meyer says the expansion rate of the universe is fine-tuned to 1 part in a trillion, 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 trillion. This is from The Case for a Creator by Lee Strobel. Now, that's not 5 trillion. That's a trillion times a trillion times a trillion times a trillion times a trillion. And that's within 1/1,000,000th of a second from when the Big Bang started. So this is virtually instantaneous. These laws, or the expansion rate, had to be set. Even Stephen Hawking said if the rate of expansion 1 second after the Big Bang had been smaller than 1 part in 100,000 million million, it would have collapsed before it reached its present size. So the expansion rate of the universe had to be perfect. If it was any faster, everything would have flown apart so quickly we would have had heat death. If it had been slower, everything would have collapsed back upon itself and we would have had a black hole. Since we do not live in a universe that is a black hole or has suffered heat death, we know that that didn't happen. So both Stephen Hawking and Stephen Meyer acknowledge that the expansion rate had to be perfectly balanced. In addition to the expansion rate, Stephen Meyer, in the Return of the God hypothesis, talks about that first millionth of a second after the Big Bang, that the fundamental physical forces were already in existence. The 4 fundamental forces that, according to physics and Meyer, that came to be in that moment were gravity, the electromagnetic force, the strong nuclear force, and the weak nuclear force. All 4 of those forces existed at that millionth of a second. So virtually instantaneously with the Big Bang. We've talked about what gravity does, but it governs the attraction between our stars and planets and galaxies and allows us to have stars that form, planets that form, galaxies that form. If gravity was different at all, our sun wouldn't have formed. I think the statistic on that is 0.0000000000001%. I mean, that's 37 zeros. I don't think I said 37 zeros, but it's 37 zeros. So it's 0.037 zeros, 1%. If it was different by that much, our sun wouldn't be here. And that's from I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist by Frank Turek and Norm Geisler. So that is an example of not just that the universe started from nothing, but that it also was finely tuned. And we're not going to get too far into the fine-tuning argument tonight because that's a separate argument called the teleological argument. But I wanted to at least give you that little tidbit because that initial second, not even second, a millionth of a second, is crucial to understanding all of the laws of physics had to be set in place at that moment. The electromagnetic force governs how particles react to each other, electricity, magnetism, light, chemical bonding. Obviously, these are important things. The structure of our atoms and molecules, the universe wouldn't exist without that force. The strong nuclear force holds the nuclei of atoms together. It binds the protons and the neutrons together and the core. And that's incredibly strong, but it acts at the subatomic level. If it were slightly weaker, then we wouldn't have elements heavier than hydrogen. If it was slightly stronger, our stars would burn out too quickly and we wouldn't have a sun that can sustain life the way ours does. The weak nuclear force, it governs things like radioactive decay and plays a role in how stars produce energy and various elements, controls how the neutrons convert into protons and vice versa. So it's critical for things like nuclear fission. Again, its precision is finely calibrated for a life-permitting universe. Now, Stephen Meyer brings these points up because he wants to highlight that within a millionth of a second after the universe began, these four fundamental forces were set with incredible precision. Their relative strengths and relationships determine the entire structure of the cosmos, which points to intelligent cause rather than just chance. Now, from the Return of the God hypothesis, which is this week's book recommendation by Stephen Meyer, okay, he says, the fundamental forces came into existence and were exquisitely calibrated within the first instance of the universe's life. The odds of such fine-tuning by chance are beyond comprehension, indicating purpose and design at the foundation of reality. Now, one of the objections that we didn't get into last time about the cosmological argument is the idea that there could be a multiverse. So the concept behind the multiverse is that there's a multiverse generator and it's just spitting out universes and they're all different. I don't know if any of you are nerds, but I used to watch this TV show called Sliders, and it was the idea that there were a multiverse and every single universe was slightly different in some way. A different choice had been made here, a different outcome resulted here, and these four travelers slide into these different universes and they're all similar. Okay, they all allow for life. Obviously the TV show wouldn't have lasted very long if they'd slid into a world that didn't. Okay, but the concept is the same. This idea that there are countless, infinite numbers of universes, and we just happen to be in the one that allows for life. Now, some of the ideas behind why this doesn't work is if there's an infinite number of universes, there would also have to be an infinite number of universes that allow for life. So it kind of doesn't make sense that ours would be then somehow special. It also can't ever be proven. There's no empirical evidence of any kind, and we can never hope to have any because we cannot experience anything outside of our universe. No telescope, no experiment has ever detected anything outside of this universe. Now, that doesn't mean outside of our material realm. That's another conversation, but outside of this universe. So it's a purely theoretical concept. It's a mathematical extrapolation of possibility. But what it really does is shift the conversation. Instead of saying, well, what caused our universe? It's, well, we've got this multiverse generator. Okay, well, what caused the multiverse generator? So it really just backs up the question one step. Well, who created that generator? Or who causes that to generate? Where did it come from? So it just moves that question of origin back one level. So fine-tuning still demands an explanation. Fine-tuning is an argument we will discuss in a different podcast, and we will get into all the nitty-gritty of why there's so much evidence in our universe that the universe has been finely tuned for life, that Christopher Hitchens, a famous atheist, thought it was one of the best arguments for the existence of God. So random chance can't explain the constants that we see in our universe that are required for life. You know, it violates the principle of Occam's razor, which is the idea that the simplest explanation is usually the right one. So the simplest explanation would be that there's some sort of transcendent creator. Now, we don't have empirical evidence of that either. And we can't test whether God exists with our senses in a way that's scientifically pleasing. Like, we don't have video of it happening. None of us were there. So we can't prove that empirically either. But we can look at the data that we have and believe that it makes the most sense that there is some sort of intelligent creator behind the universe. That the beginning of the universe, the beginning of all space, all time, and all matter, the fine tuning of all the physical constants, the rational intelligibility of the universe had to come from somewhere. The only argument we have is that, well, nothing can be created from nothing. And to that, we all agree. So, what makes more sense? Everything was created out of nothing by nothing? Or everything was created out of nothing by something with the ability to create from nothing? And that leaves us back to where we ended up last time, with a spaceless, timeless, immaterial, all-powerful, intelligent, and personal creator who chose to bring the universe into existence. Now, just this week, I was talking with a friend of mine on a Zoom call about science and creation, and we were talking about a quote, and he's like, "Oh, I remember this quote," and I was like, "Oh, I know where that is." So I just wanted to share this quote with you because I really love this little vignette. It says, "For the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He's about to conquer the highest peak. And as he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries." Now that's Robert Jastrow from God and the Astronomers, 1978. Jastrow was not a Christian, but he was making a profound observation about the limits of science. Science went through all this empirical research and eventually discovered what the Bible said all along, that the universe had a beginning. Genesis 1:1. So the irony is that science, after centuries of saying the universe had always existed, of denying what the Bible said, finally caught up to what we always believed. Now, you may say that this is not enough for you to believe. And I say, I understand. There's no silver bullet, that one argument that just is going to bring everyone to believe the same things. What I encourage you to do is just continue to create the stack of evidence. At some point, you will get to a place where there's enough evidence to trust that this is the best answer. We call it the preponderance of evidence. So there's no one argument that's going to win the case for everybody. But I'm asking you to join me. We're going to keep piling up the evidence until we have a good reason to reach a conclusion. And that pile might look different for each of us. We might each come to a different place where we say, that was enough for me. Okay. But I hope that you'll join me as we keep seeking truth. Hold fast to your faith. Never be afraid to ask the hard questions, because God has the answers. If you've enjoyed our podcast so far, please like and subscribe. Give it a share. Maybe leave me a review wherever you get your podcasts. It'll help more people find our content. And also be sure to follow me on social media. You can find the Mom Apologist on Facebook, Instagram, X, TikTok, as well as YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. Thank you for joining me today. Until next time.